On the eve of his hanging, when the sky above the frontier town of Briar's End lay heavy with low clouds and the wooden gallows creaked softly like an old thing remembering too much, Jonah Rook was granted one final night alone, and it was in that lonely hour, when the jailhouse lantern burned low and the wind slipped through the cracks like a whispering witness, that he finally allowed himself to speak, not to a priest or a judge or the curious townsfolk who would gather at dawn, but to the silence itself, which had always been his truest companion. He sat on the narrow cot with his wrists free for the first time in years, staring at his hands as if they belonged to another man, hands that had held rain slick with rain, hands that had taken and lost and buried more than they ever deserved to touch, and he wondered how many stories had been told about those hands, how many lies had grown around his name until Jonah Rook was no longer a man but a shadow stitched together by fear and rumor, a legend soaked in blood and gun smoke, when the truth, his truth, had never once been asked for, never once been wanted. The wind outside stirred the ropes of the gallows, and the sound pulled him back to a memory so old it felt like it belonged to someone else, a younger man who had once believed the land could be kind if you treated it right, who had once believed that love was a thing that stayed if you held it carefully. And Jonah let out a breath that trembled as he began his confession, not aloud at first but in the quiet space behind his eyes, where no one could interrupt or judge, where the past unfolded not as a trail of crimes but as a chain of choices made in fear, made in grief, made in moments when the world had already turned its back. He thought of the first time someone called him an outlaw, how the word had felt too large for his mouth, too heavy for his shoulders, how it had followed him like a curse once spoken, and he remembered the night that truly began it all, not with a gunshot, as the stories claimed, but with a promise whispered under a sky full of stars, a promise he had failed to keep, a promise tied to a woman whose name he had never spoken since the day he left her standing at the edge of a river with tears she refused to let fall. Her name was Eliza Hart, and the world believed Jonah Rook had never loved anything but the open road, but that was the lie that hurt the most, because loving her had been the truest thing he had ever done, and losing her had been the moment the man he was meant to be slipped quietly into the dark. The wind pressed harder against the jailhouse, and Jonah leaned back against the cold stone wall, closing his eyes as memories came in slow waves, the small homestead they had dreamed of, the way Eliza used to hum while cooking, the fear in her eyes when violence crept too close, the night he chose to leave to protect her and the child she carried, believing distance would be kinder than staying. Never knowing that absence could wound deeper than any blade, no one knew that the outlaw they cursed in the streets had once sent money anonymously to a dozen towns, that the robberies blamed on greed had often been desperate trades to keep others alive, that the blood-soaked legend hid a man who never fired first, who carried guilt heavier than his gun, who woke screaming from dreams where every face he had failed stood waiting in judgment. Jonah opened his eyes and stared at the small barred window, where a slice of moonlight painted the floor like a path he could no longer take, and he wondered if confessions mattered when no one was left to hear them, if truth had any weight once a man's end was already written. Yet something inside him insisted on being spoken at last, because the greatest secret of all, the one that could unravel the legend entirely, was not about stolen gold or hidden graves, but about mercy, about the moment he chose not to kill when killing would have saved him, the moment that had sealed his fate even as it saved another's soul. It had happened years ago in a canyon where the earth rose red and unforgiving, when Jonah had faced a lawman barely old enough to shave, trembling behind a badge that shone brighter than his courage. And in that instant Jonah saw not an enemy but a boy with a mother somewhere praying for his safe return, and Jonah lowered his gun, turned away, and ran, knowing full well the story would never tell it that way, knowing mercy would never make him innocent in the eyes of a world hungry for monsters. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts of all the men he had been, and Jonah felt the hours slipping away, each one a step closer to the rope waiting patiently outside, and still he spoke silently, telling the wind about the child he had never met but always loved, the child he believed was better off thinking their father a villain than knowing him as a broken man, telling the darkness that every crime laid at his feet carried a weight he had never escaped, that the legend of Jonah Rook had been built because it was easier than understanding a man shaped by loss and choice and a land that offered no gentle paths. As the night deepened, the wind softened, almost as if listening, and Jonah's confession grew quieter, more intimate, until it felt less like words and more like a letting go, a surrender not to the law or the gallows but to truth itself. And in that stillness, with dawn creeping closer and the Wild West holding its breath, Jonah Rook, the outlaw, the myth, the condemned, finally allowed himself one last fragile hope, that somewhere beyond the rope and the silence, the truth might outlive the legend, and that the blood-soaked stories told about him would one day be undone by a single, whispered understanding of who he really was. When Margaret Hale arrived in the desert town of Red Mesa, she did not announce herself, did not ask for help, and did not explain why a woman with calm eyes and a quiet voice would choose a place scorched by sun and haunted by fear. Yet within days her name moved through the town like a warning carried on dry wind, whispered from porch to porch and behind saloon doors, because everyone knew the stories, how every outlaw who had ever loved her had met a violent end, how she had buried more men than most preachers, how grief followed her like a shadow that lengthened at sunset, and though no one could point to a crime she had committed, men still crossed the street to avoid her gaze, unsure whether she was cursed, dangerous, or simply a mirror reflecting the cost of the lives they led. Margaret lived alone in a small adobe house at the edge of town where the land began to rise toward red cliffs, and each morning she swept her doorstep, fetched water, and carried herself with a composure that suggested she had learned long ago how to survive without expecting kindness. Her black dress is simple and modest, her hair always neatly pinned, her grief worn not as a display but as a private companion she had grown used to carrying. She had loved once as a young woman, then again after loss reshaped her heart, and each time the men she loved were drawn to danger as if the West itself had marked them, and each time she had stood by a fresh grave under an unforgiving sky, learning that love in this land was often brief and always costly. So when she settled in Red Mesa she made a quiet vow to herself that there would be no more attachments, no more hope that could be torn away, only a small, steady life shaped by routine and silence. Yet fate, which had never respected her promises, arrived one afternoon in the form of a wounded gunslinger who collapsed just beyond her door as the sun burned high and the cicadas cried out as if announcing trouble, and Margaret found him there when she returned from the well, his body twisted in the dust, blood darkening his shirt, his revolver fallen from a slack hand, and in that moment she stood frozen, the weight of every whispered story pressing against her chest, because she knew exactly what the town would say if she dragged him inside, knew how easily fear would sharpen into blame. But she also knew the cost of turning away, knew the sound of a man's last breath when no one answered his need, and so she knelt beside him without another thought, her movements calm and practiced, and hauled him across her threshold, sealing her fate with the same quiet resolve that had defined her life. His name, she learned later as fever loosened his tongue, was Caleb Rowan, a man chased by both law and memory, a gunslinger whose reputation had reached Red Mesa long before his body did, and as Margaret cleaned his wound, pressed cloth to torn flesh, and whispered steady words meant more for herself than for him, she felt the old ache stir inside her, not desire at first but recognition, the knowledge of what it meant to love a man shaped by violence and regret, and she told herself again and again that this was only mercy, only kindness, nothing more. Yet as days passed and Caleb lingered between life and death under her care, something fragile and unwanted began to grow, woven from shared silences, from the way his eyes softened when he woke to see her there, from the gratitude he never spoke aloud but carried in the careful way he watched her, as if afraid she might vanish like so many things before. Outside, the town watched her house with narrowed eyes, the rumors growing sharper as word spread that the widow of Red Mesa had taken in another outlaw, and men shook their heads, certain they were witnessing the beginning of another tragic ending, while Margaret, inside her small home, moved through long afternoons filled with the smell of medicine and dust and sunlight slanting through the window, telling herself she would not ask Caleb about his past, would not invite stories that could bind her heart. Yet sometimes at night, when the desert cooled and the stars emerged like quiet witnesses, he would speak anyway, his voice low and rough, confessing fragments of a life spent running, of mistakes made too young and paid for too long, and Margaret listened without judgment, because she understood better than most how a single choice could echo through a lifetime. As Caleb grew stronger, sitting up, then walking slowly across the room, the space between them filled with an unspoken awareness, not the reckless passion of youth but something heavier and more restrained, shaped by loss and caution, by two people who knew exactly how much there was to lose, and when their hands brushed by accident, both felt it, the pull and the fear tangled together, and Margaret would step back, reminding herself of the graves she had stood beside, of the way hope had betrayed her before, while Caleb, seeing her withdrawal, told himself he would leave as soon as he could ride, because staying felt too dangerous, not just for his life but for the quiet, careful world she had built around herself. The desert, however, has a way of pressing truths to the surface, and one evening as a dust storm rolled in, trapping them inside with wind howling against the walls, Caleb finally said what hovered between them, telling her he knew her reputation, knew the stories that followed her like a curse, and Margaret, tired of being defined by whispers, met his gaze and told him the truth, that she was not death, not fate, just a woman who had loved men who lived by the gun, men who could never outrun the violence that shaped them, and that loving them had not killed them, but it had taught her how deeply the heart could break. Caleb listened, his expression softened by understanding, and in that shared honesty something settled between them, not a promise, not yet, but a recognition that neither of them was what the stories claimed, and for a brief, dangerous moment, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different ending, one where love did not demand blood in return, but Red Mesa was not a town that allowed secrets to rest, and as Caleb's strength returned, so did the attention of men who feared his presence and resented Margaret's defiance of the role they had assigned her, and whispers grew louder, warning that the widow's curse would claim another, that trouble always followed her door, and Margaret felt the weight of those words press against her resolve, because she knew how easily fear could turn into violence in a place like this, knew how quickly a man like Caleb could be forced back into the life he was trying to leave behind. One morning, as the sun rose harsh and unyielding, Caleb stood at her door with his hat in his hands and told her he would be leaving before he brought danger down on her, and Margaret felt the old heartbreak rise again, sharp and familiar, because part of her wanted to beg him to stay, to risk hope one last time, while another part, wiser and more wounded, knew that love sometimes meant letting go before fate demanded a higher price. They stood there in the quiet, the desert stretching endlessly beyond them, and when Caleb reached for her hand, his touch gentle and uncertain, Margaret did not pull away, because some moments deserved to be held even if they could not last, and as he rode out beneath the burning western sun, carrying both gratitude and longing with him, Margaret watched until he disappeared into the shimmer of heat, unaware that fate, patient and unrelenting, was already weaving their paths together again, tightening its threads with every step he took away from Red Mesa. Deadwood Crossing had not known the weight of true law in years, not since the last badge had been buried beneath the dust along with the man who wore it, and by the time Thomas Avery rode into town beneath a sky bleached pale by relentless sun, the place had learned to survive on fear, silence, and uneasy bargains, its streets lined with buildings that leaned like tired men and faces that turned away at the sound of approaching hooves, because strangers usually meant trouble and trouble always meant blood. Yet Thomas Avery did not look like the kind of man who brought storms with him, not anymore, for he rode slow and stiff in the saddle, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible weight, his coat worn thin, his eyes marked by something deeper than exhaustion, and the badge pinned to his chest, dull, scratched, and carefully polished, looked less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder he could never quite escape. He had not planned to stop at Deadwood Crossing, had not planned to wear the badge again at all, but the road had led him here the way roads often do in the West, with quiet insistence and no concern for the past a man hoped to outrun, and as he dismounted near the center of town, ignoring the curious and wary stares, Thomas felt the old ache rise in his chest, the familiar tightening that came whenever he stood somewhere lawless and knew, deep down, that turning away would cost more than staying. Years ago, he had been a marshal with a steady hand and a strong sense of right, a man who believed that order could be restored if one stood firm enough, but that belief had shattered in a place much like this one, when a single failure, one moment of hesitation, had led to the deaths of people he was sworn to protect, including a deputy he had trained like a younger brother and a woman whose trust he had never deserved to lose. And when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, Thomas Avery had turned in his badge and walked away, convinced that wearing it again would only invite more ghosts to follow. Now, those ghosts seemed to rise from the very dirt of Deadwood Crossing. As he walked toward the saloon, his boots echoing too loudly in the quiet, because the town was bracing itself for something, though no one spoke it aloud, and it did not take long for Thomas to learn why, for inside the saloon, amid the smell of stale whiskey and dust, men spoke in low voices of Calder Boone, a warlord in all but name, a man who had claimed the surrounding territory through violence and fear, who planned to ride into Deadwood Crossing within days to claim it as his own, and the town, stripped of any real defense, was preparing the only way it knew how, by choosing sides, by hiding, by hoping someone else would bleed in their place. Thomas listened without interrupting, nursing a glass of water instead of whiskey, feeling the familiar pull between leaving and staying tightened with every word, because he knew men like Boone, knew the damage they left behind, and knew that if he walked away again, the faces he would never forget would only multiply. When the barkeep finally asked if he was Law, Thomas hesitated, the pause stretching long enough for memory to rush in. The sound of gunfire, the look of betrayal, the weight of a badge pulled free from his coat and dropped onto a table, and for a moment he almost said no, almost chose the easier lie, but then he felt the badge against his chest and answered quietly, "I was," and something in the room shifted, hope and resentment tangling together, because a broken marshal was still more than no marshal at all. By nightfall, word had spread, and people came to him not with cheers but with questions edged in desperation, asking if he would stand for them, if he would wear the badge openly, if he would face Boone when he came, and Thomas, exhausted by the weight of their need, told them only that he would do what he could, because promises were dangerous things and he had learned too well how easily they could be broken. That night, he slept little in a borrowed room above the saloon, haunted by dreams of the past failure that had cost him everything, reliving the moment he had waited too long to draw, too long to act, and as dawn broke, he rose with a quiet resolve that surprised even him, because while fear still lived in him, so did a sense of responsibility he could never fully silence. Over the next days, Thomas walked the town, assessing defenses that barely existed, speaking to men who had never held a rifle steady and women who understood that survival might soon depend on choices no one wanted to make, and though some doubted him, others found strength in his calm, in the way he did not pretend this would be easy or clean, in the way he acknowledged the cost without flinching. Each evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in shades of fire and rust, Thomas stood alone at the edge of town, staring out toward the road Boone would take, feeling the ghosts of his past gather close, and instead of pushing them away, he faced them, admitting his failure, accepting his guilt, and understanding at last that redemption was not about erasing mistakes but about choosing differently when given another chance. When Boone's riders finally appeared on the horizon, dust rising like a warning, Deadwood Crossing held its breath, and Thomas Avery stepped into the street, badge visible, spine straight despite the fear clawing at him, because this time he would not look away, would not wait for someone else to act, and though he knew the coming fight would test every ounce of strength he had left, he also knew that whatever the outcome, the man who rode into Deadwood Crossing broken and burdened would not be the same man who faced the war he could no longer run from, for in standing his ground at last, Thomas Avery was not just defending a forgotten town, he was finally answering the call he had tried so hard to silence, proving that even a shattered badge could still stand for something when worn by a man willing to face his ghosts head-on. Deep in Black Canyon, where the rock walls rose like dark sentinels and the sun seemed afraid to linger, there was said to be a hidden vein of gold so rich it could turn a pauper into a king, yet so cursed that every soul who chased it vanished or returned broken. And Samuel Crow, a desperate prospector with dust in his lungs and failure stitched into every line of his face, had sworn all his life he did not believe in such stories until the day a dying man pressed a brittle scrap of paper into his hand and whispered that the canyon did not take men by force but by invitation. Samuel had been drifting from camp to camp, chasing rumors that never paid and promises that always faded, carrying with him the quiet shame of a family left behind and a future that seemed to narrow with every mile. And when he unfolded the map beneath a flickering lantern that night, its ink faded and strange symbols etched into the margins, he felt something stir inside him that was not quite hope and not quite fear, a pull that seemed to recognize him as if the canyon itself had been waiting. The next morning he set out alone, telling no one where he was headed, because men who chased cursed gold rarely wanted witnesses, and as the desert stretched endlessly before him, Samuel began to notice small things that unsettled him, the way the wind shifted suddenly as if carrying half-formed words, the way his horse snorted and resisted whenever they angled toward Black Canyon, the way his thoughts seemed no longer entirely his own, lingering too long on images of wealth, of returning home triumphant, of proving that his life had not been a long chain of mistakes. By the time the canyon came into view, its shadows pooling thick and dark even under the high sun, Samuel could swear he heard whispers riding the wind, low and coaxing, speaking his name with unsettling familiarity, promising rest, success, absolution, and though he told himself it was only exhaustion, only the tricks of heat and solitude, his heart quickened with each step closer, because the voices did not demand outright, did not threaten or rage, but spoke gently, like old friends who knew exactly what he wanted most. Inside the canyon, the air cooled unnaturally, and sound seemed to dull as if swallowed by the stone, and Samuel followed the map through narrow passes where light barely touched the ground, feeling watched not by eyes but by something older and deeper, something patient, and when he finally reached a hollow marked by a twisted dead tree, its roots clawing at the earth like frozen hands, the whispers grew clearer, praising his courage, his suffering, telling him he deserved what others had taken from him. That fate owed him a debt long overdue, Digging began as a simple act, shovel biting into gravel and rock, yet with every strike Samuel felt lighter and heavier all at once, memories surfacing unbidden, his wife's tired smile the night he left, his child's small hand slipping from his grasp, the many mornings he woke to the same hunger and disappointment, and the voices twisted these memories gently, not denying them but reframing them, suggesting that gold could heal all wounds, that success would make forgiveness easy, that love would return once he returned victorious. When his shovel struck something solid and bright, Samuel fell to his knees, breath caught in his chest, because there it was, a vein of gold gleaming unnaturally in the half-light, richer than anything he had ever seen, and as his hands touched it, warmth surged through him, followed by a sudden wave of dizziness, and the whispers grew louder, now closer, no longer riding the wind but pressing from inside his own thoughts, thanking him for finding them, for believing, for listening. It was then Samuel noticed the bones scattered half-buried in the dirt around him, old and new, some clutching tools, some reaching toward the gold as if frozen mid-plea, and fear finally cut through the fog in his mind, because he understood at last that the price had never been spoken aloud because it was meant to be chosen, that the canyon did not steal life outright but offered a bargain that required surrender, of memory, of restraint, of the very self that could still turn away. Trembling, Samuel tried to stand, tried to step back from the vein, but the whispers turned soothing once more, telling him he was already too far gone, that everyone who entered the canyon carried a hunger that belonged to it now, that the gold was not cursed by the devil but shaped by men's longing, feeding on their willingness to trade tomorrow for today. Hours or perhaps days passed in a blur as Samuel worked feverishly, filling his pack while his thoughts grew fragmented, time losing its meaning, the outside world fading into something distant and unimportant. And when at last his strength failed and he collapsed against the canyon wall, clutching the gold as if it could anchor him, the whispers softened, no longer coaxing but comforting, telling him he could rest now, that he had done well, that his struggle was over. Long after the sun set beyond the canyon's reach, a faint wind carried a new sound through Black Canyon, the quiet murmur of another voice added to the chorus, a prospector's voice, weary and resigned, repeating the same promises to no one and everyone, and far beyond the canyon's shadows, rumors would continue to spread of devil's gold waiting to be claimed, because the map would find another desperate hand, and Black Canyon, patient and listening, would whisper again, ready to collect its terrible price from anyone willing to believe that riches came without cost.